She bought a burnt forest cabin for $1. Henrik Thorson, who had survived 19 Wisconsin winters, told her plainly, "Those boys will freeze in their beds, and no one will find your bodies until spring." She had 14 cents, two sons, and needed 6 cords of firewood she could not cut. On January 9th, 1872, the temperature dropped 43 degrees in 9 hours. But 3 months earlier, Marta Svensson had never spent a single winter without a husband, never felled a tree, never sealed a cabin alone. She arrived in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, on a morning in May when the sawdust hung so thick in the air she could taste it. The town smelled of cut pine and ambition. 800 men worked at William B. Ogden's woodenware factory, the largest in the world, people said, turning Wisconsin timber into tubs, pails, clothespins, and shingles that shipped down the river and across the Great Lakes to Chicago and beyond. Marta was 29 years old. Her husband Gunnar walked beside her, their 2 sons between them, Eric, 6, serious and watchful, Lars, 4, clutching his mother's skirt. They had crossed an ocean and half a continent to reach this place. Gunnar had a job waiting at the factory, $3 a day, enough to rent a cabin on the edge of town and save for land of their own. The cabin they rented was small, 12 by 14 feet, single room, dirt floor packed hard. But it had a cast iron stove that drew well, and the walls were tight, and Gunnar said they would build something better within 2 years. Marta believed him. She had no reason not to. Summer passed in sawdust and sweat. Gunnar came home exhausted each evening, hands rough from the lathes, smelling of pine sap. Marta kept the cabin, tended a garden behind it, watched the boys while her husband fed the machine that was making them a future. October came early that year. The summer had been dry, barely any rain since June, and the forests around Peshtigo crackled with fallen branches and dead slash from the logging operations. Small fires burned constantly in the clearings where settlers burned brush to prepare their land. No one worried. Fires were part of life here. On the morning of October 8th, 1871, the sky turned the color of a bruise. By noon, the wind had risen. By 3 o'clock, ash fell like black snow. Gunnar did not come home from the factory. Marta gathered her sons and walked toward town to find him. She never reached it. The fire came not as flames, but as a wall of heat. The air itself seemed to catch fire. Trees exploded. The ground burned. People ran screaming toward the river, the only water large enough to offer any hope, and Marta ran with them, a boy under each arm, her lungs filling with smoke that tasted like the end of the world. She reached the Peshtigo River as the fire roared over them. She waded in until the water reached her chest, her sons clinging to her neck, their faces pressed against her as she ducked them under again and again to escape the flames that swept across the surface. The river boiled with desperate people. Some drowned, some breathed fire and died standing in the water. Marta held her sons and did not let go. 5 hours. That is how long they stayed in the river. When dawn came and the fires had passed, Marta climbed out onto a bank that no longer looked like earth. Everything was ash. The trees were black spires. The town was gone. Gunnar was gone. They found what remained of him 3 days later near the factory. 1,500 people died that night. Some estimates said more, 2,000, 2,500. No one would ever know exactly. Entire families vanished without anyone left to report them missing. Marta Svensson was 29 years old. She had 2 sons, no husband, and 14 cents in the pocket of a dress that smelled of smoke. The relief supplies came slowly. Chicago had burned the same night, the same hour, some said, and the great city's disaster swallowed the nation's attention while Peshtigo's dead went uncounted. What aid arrived was thin: flour, salt pork, blankets that smelled of other people's charity. The survivors gathered in clusters, sorting themselves by what they had left. Those with family elsewhere made plans to leave. Those with money rebuilt. Those with neither waited, hoping for something they could not name. Marta waited with them. 3 weeks after the fire, a man named Aldous Breck rode through what remained of the settlement. He worked for the Wisconsin Central Railroad, and he carried a leather satchel full of papers and a pocket full of coins. The railroad wanted land. Burnt land was cheap land, and Breck had authority to buy. He stopped at a charred structure on the forest's edge, a cabin that had somehow survived the inferno. Its walls were black as coal, its roof intact, its single window gaping like a blind eye. A lumber speculator had built it from green timber just that spring. The unseasoned wood had charred but not combusted. The speculator wanted nothing to do with it now. He had fled to Milwaukee and sent word that Breck could sell the property for whatever it would bring. Breck offered it to Marta for $1. She stared at him. The cabin was a ruin. Its walls looked like something dragged from a furnace. The logs were blackened 2 inches deep in places, and the gaps between them gaped where the chinking had burned away entirely. "Why?" she asked. Breck shrugged. "The railroad doesn't want structures. We want land. The cabin's worthless. Tear it down or live in it, I don't care. $1 clears the title." She had $1.14. The dollar went to Breck. The 14 cents stayed in her pocket. Marta Svensson now owned a burnt cabin on burnt land at the edge of a burnt forest. Her sons would sleep in walls that looked like they belonged in hell. And winter was 8 weeks away. Henrik Thorson came to see her on the 3rd day. He was 63 years old, built like a barrel, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same oak he used for axe handles. He had arrived in Wisconsin in 1852, when the territory was still more forest than farms. He had built 7 cabins in 19 years. He had buried 2 wives, the first to childbirth, the second to pneumonia after a chimney fire that nearly took him too. When Thorson spoke about winter, people listened. He had earned that authority with frozen fingers and dead livestock and nights spent feeding fires while the temperature dropped to numbers that killed men who made mistakes. He walked around Marta's cabin slowly, running his hand along the charred logs, peering at the gaps where chinking had burned away, studying the roof where blackened shingles curled like dead leaves. Then he looked at her. "You know what this is?" he asked. "A cabin. This is a burnt shell. The logs are compromised. Fire weakens wood, makes it brittle. The chinking is gone, and standard daubing won't stick to a charred surface. You'll spend a month sealing these gaps, and they'll crack open with the first hard freeze." He pointed at the stove visible through the open door. "The fire bricks are damaged. Without them, you'll get half the heat and twice the fire risk." Marta said nothing. She had learned in the weeks since Gunnar's death that men liked to talk and women were expected to listen. Thorson continued. "A cabin this size needs 6 cords to get through winter. 8 is safer. Each cord takes a grown man 12 to 15 hours to fell, buck, split, and stack. You've got." He looked around the property, at the charred stumps and ash-covered ground. Nothing. No standing timber worth cutting within a quarter mile. No husband. "No. I know what I have." He stopped, looked at her again. Something flickered in his expression, not quite respect, but perhaps surprise that she had interrupted him. "Mrs. Svensson," he said, and his voice was not unkind. "I've seen widows try to winter alone. I've seen what happens to them. A woman alone can't cut enough timber. She can't keep a fire burning through a 30-below night and watch children at the same time. She can't... What would you have me do? Go to Green Bay. Find family. Find a husband. Find anyone who'll take you in. He looked at the cabin again, at the black walls and the empty door frame, and the two small boys watching from inside. You won't last until Christmas in this place. Those boys will freeze in their beds, and no one will find your bodies until spring. He said it plainly, without cruelty. He said it the way a man states a fact he has verified through experience. The sky is blue. Water flows downhill. A widow in a burnt cabin will die. Marta looked at him, at the cabin behind her, at the two faces watching from the darkness inside. I have nowhere else to go, she said. Thorson held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly, the way a man nods when he has already written someone off. I'll tell the relief committee to check on you, he said, when it's over. He walked away without looking back. October became November. The temperature dropped. The ash that covered everything turned to mud when it rained, then froze into a gray crust that crunched under Marta's feet. She worked. The first week, she gathered charcoal. The fire had left it everywhere, fragments of burnt wood ranging from splinters to chunks the size of her fist. She filled buckets and dragged them back to the cabin, piling them against the wall she had designated for storage. The boys helped when they could. Eric carried small loads with serious determination. Lars mostly played in the ash, his hands turning black, his laughter the only bright sound in that gray landscape. The second week she found clay. The riverbank, where she had crouched in terror while the world burned, held deposits of dense gray mud beneath the ash layer. She dug it with her hands, loaded it into the buckets that had held charcoal, carried it back in loads that made her shoulders ache and her back scream. The third week she began to seal the cabin. She did not know exactly what she was doing. No one had taught her this. But she remembered her father, in the village outside Trondheim, burning the ends of fence posts before planting them. Brent Trey store länger, he had said. Burnt wood stands longer. The charred layer kept water out, kept rot away, made posts last twice as long as untreated wood. And she remembered something else. Her grandmother's house, the old one in the hills, where the walls had been dark with generations of smoke. That house had been warm even in January, warmer than the newer houses in the village. Her grandmother had called it the black warmth, and smiled in a way that suggested she knew things she wasn't saying. Marta looked at her charred walls, at the black surface that covered them, at the bucket of charcoal fragments at her feet. What if burnt wood did more than resist rot? What if it held heat differently too? She crushed the charcoal into smaller pieces, mixed it with the clay, added water from the river. The result was a thick black paste that stank of fire and earth. She took a handful and pressed it into a gap between two logs. It stuck. The charred surface, rough and porous, gripped the black clay better than smooth wood would have. She added more, building up the layer, pressing it firm. When she stepped back, the gap was sealed, black chinking against black wood, invisible unless you looked closely. She did not know that she had created a primitive biochar clay composite, a mixture with 40% lower thermal conductivity than standard clay chinking. She did not know the words thermal conductivity. She only knew that the mixture felt right, that it used what the fire had left behind, that it was the only option she had. That night, she sealed a 3-foot section of the north wall. The boys slept on a pallet near the stove while she worked by candlelight, her hands black to the wrists, the smell of char in her nose. She had no idea if it would hold. She had no idea if any of this would matter. But it was better than waiting to die. Ingrid Nielsen came to visit on a morning when frost covered the ground and Marta's breath hung white in the air. Ingrid was 41, a widow like Marta. Her husband had burned in the same fire that took Gunnar, but Ingrid had brothers who had survived. strong men who were building her a new cabin on the edge of town. She slept in a tent beside the construction site, ate meals with her relatives, had people around her who would not let her freeze. She had come, she said, to see how Marta was managing. What she found was a woman covered in black paste, sealing gaps in a charred wall with a mixture that looked like it had been scraped from the bottom of a forge. "What are you doing?" Marta did not stop working. "Chinking." "With what?" "That's not—" Ingrid stepped closer, examining the dark mixture. "Is that charcoal?" "Charcoal and clay." "That's not how you seal a cabin." "It's how I'm sealing this one." Ingrid watched for a long moment. Her face carried the expression of someone trying to find polite words for a question that wasn't polite. "Marta," she said finally, "you're sealing burnt wood with burnt clay. The whole thing is going to fall apart come spring, if it even lasts until spring. You can't— this isn't—" She stopped, took a breath. "Have you thought about what you're actually doing here?" Marta pressed another handful of the mixture into the gap, smoothing it flat. "I'm doing what I can with what I have." "But the logic of it, you're not building something new. You're just covering up something ruined. Charred material is weakened material. Everyone knows that. My father used to char fence posts before planting them. They lasted twice as long as the others. Fence posts don't need to hold heat. You're not building a fence. You're trying to survive January." Marta finally turned to look at her. Ingrid's face was concerned, not hostile. She had come to help, or at least to understand. She was raising objections because she could see no answers to them. "The charred wood resists water," Marta said. "It doesn't rot. It doesn't soak up rain. And the black surface—" She touched the wall where the morning sun had been striking it for an hour. "Feel this." Ingrid hesitated, then placed her palm against the charred log. "It's warm," she said, surprised. "The black drinks the sun. I've watched it. On clear days, this wall feels warm by afternoon, even when the air's cold. The pale wood in a new cabin doesn't do that." Ingrid pulled her hand back, frowning. "That doesn't mean—" "I know what it doesn't mean. I know this might not work. I know I might freeze. I know everything you're thinking and everything Thorson said and everything everyone believes." Marta turned back to the wall, took another handful of the black clay. "I also know I have no money, no husband, and no way to cut 6 cords of firewood. If conventional methods would save me, I would use them. But they won't, so I'm trying something else." Ingrid stood in silence for a long moment. "And if it doesn't work?" "Then we freeze. Same as if I did nothing." "That's—" Ingrid shook her head. "That's not a plan, Marta. That's a gamble." "Yes." Marta smoothed another section of chinking, her hands black, her eyes fixed on the work. "It is." Ingrid left without offering to help. She was not unkind. She simply did not want to participate in something she believed was doomed. At the edge of the property, she turned back. "I hope you're right," she said. "I'll come back in February. We'll see what the cold says." Marta did not answer. She was already reaching for more clay. The word spread. By mid-November, everyone in what remained of Peshtigo knew about the Norwegian widow in the burnt cabin. They knew she was sealing the walls with charcoal and clay. They knew she had barely any firewood, no husband, no realistic hope of surviving winter. The opinions varied. Some thought she was mad, touched by the fire, they said, as though the trauma had broken something in her mind. Some thought she was foolish, a foreigner who didn't understand Wisconsin winters and would learn the hard way. Some thought she was simply desperate, doing whatever came to hand because she had no better options. None of them offered to help. Aldous Breck returned in late November. He rode the same horse, carried the same leather satchel, wore the same expression of professional disinterest that masked whatever he actually thought about the people whose land he was buying. He found Marta on a ladder, a broken thing she had salvaged from the burnt wreckage of a barn, sealing the upper gaps on the cabin's north wall. Her hands were cracked from the cold, her dress streaked with black clay, her hair escaping its braid in all directions. "Mrs. Svensson," he said, not dismounting, "I see you're still here." She did not stop working. "I am." The railroad's offer still stands. 75 cents for the property. That's generous, considering its condition. He looked at the cabin, at the black walls, at the meager pile of wood stacked beside the door. "More than generous, I'd say. I'm not selling. You understand what winter means here. I've seen the reports from Green Bay. They're predicting the coldest season in 20 years. The settlers up north are already moving their families to town." He shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. "A burnt cabin with no firewood won't keep you alive. The railroad can wait. The cold can't." Marta climbed down from the ladder, slowly, her muscles aching. She turned to face him. "Mr. Breck," she said, "when I die, you can take the land for back taxes. When I don't die, you can find someone else to bother. Either way, I'm not selling." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps. Most widows he dealt with were grateful for any offer, however insulting. "Suit yourself," he said. "I'll check back in spring, see what's left." He rode away without looking back. That night, Marta fed her sons from the bottom of the flour barrel, thin porridge that filled their bellies without nourishing them, and listened to the wind picking up outside. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since morning. The calendar said November 23rd. Winter was no longer coming. Winter was here. And she was not ready. December arrived like a door slamming shut. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there. The mud froze. The river began icing over at the edges. The few leaves that had survived the fire fell from their blackened branches, and the world became a study in gray and white and the endless black of burnt timber. Marta worked. Her hands blistered the first week, broke open the second, calloused over the third. She wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from a petticoat, kept working. The axe she had salvaged from the burnt ruins of a neighbor's barn was dull and heavy, but it split wood. That was enough. She could not fell trees. She lacked the strength, the technique, the time, but she could find standing dead timber trees that the fire had killed but not consumed, and she could hack at them with the axe until they broke apart, then drag the pieces back to her cabin. It was slow, brutally slow. Each day she might collect enough wood for 2 or 3 days burning, and each night she would burn some of what she had collected, and the pile beside the cabin grew by inches when it needed to grow by feet. The boys helped where they could. Eric, at 6, had learned to stack split wood with gaps for air circulation. Lars, at 4, gathered kindling, small sticks, and bark fragments that would catch the flame and help larger logs ignite. Marta continued the chinking. The black Marta continued the chinking. The black mixture had to be applied in layers, each one drying partially before the next was added. She worked by candlelight, by firelight, by the thin gray glow that passed for moonlight through winter clouds. Her shoulders screamed. Her back felt like someone had driven nails into it. She kept working. December 8th, the first deep freeze, -8 degrees at dawn. Marta woke to find frost on the inside of the windows, her breath visible in the air despite the stove having burned all night. But the cabin held. The temperature inside had dropped to 29 degrees, cold enough to see your breath, not cold enough to kill. She fed the stove, watched the temperature climb, noticed that the chinking she had applied to the north wall seemed intact. No cracks, no gaps reopening. She allowed herself a moment of hope. Then she went back to work. December 10th, a stranger appeared. His name was Ola Pedersen, Norwegian, like her. He had lost his wife and 3 children in the fire, all of them, gone in a single night, and he was walking to Milwaukee to find work because there was nothing left for him here. He stopped at Marta's cabin because he saw smoke rising from the chimney and wanted to ask if he was on the right road. What he found was a woman alone with 2 small boys trying to split frozen wood with an axe too heavy for her arms. "You're doing it wrong," he said. She looked up at him. He was perhaps 35, lean and weathered, with the empty eyes of a man who had stopped caring whether he lived or died. "Show me," she said. He did. The axe needed to strike at an angle, not straight down. The wood needed to be positioned on the block a certain way. The follow-through mattered more than the initial swing. In 10 minutes, she had learned more about splitting wood than she had figured out in 6 weeks of struggling. "I'll help you for the day," he said, "in exchange for a meal." She had almost nothing to offer, cold beans and cornbread made from the last of the cornmeal, but he accepted it without complaint. He worked from dawn until dark, moving with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had decided that labor was preferable to thinking. By nightfall, he had cut and split nearly half a cord of wood. Before he left, he stood looking at the cabin, at the black walls, at the thick, dark chinking. "You've got a strange cabin, Mrs. Svensson," he said, "but it's warmer than it looks." She watched him walk away into the darkness, heading south toward Milwaukee and whatever life remained to him there. She never saw him again. She never learned whether he made it, but his words stayed with her, warmer than it looks. December 20th. The chinking was complete. Marta stood in the clearing, looking at what she had built. The cabin was black from foundation to roofline, charred logs sealed with charred clay, a structure that looked like it had been dragged from a furnace. The few settlers who passed by on the road gave it wide berth, as though the blackness might be contagious. Inside, the stove burned steadily. The temperature held at 37 degrees, despite the outside air reading 12 above zero. The gaps between the logs, which had let in knife edges of cold air when she first arrived, now admitted nothing. She had done the math obsessively, tracking every stick of wood that went into the stove, measuring the temperature every morning and evening with a thermometer she had salvaged from the general store's burnt remains. The numbers looked like this. Wood supply, 2.3 cords. Conventional requirement for a cabin this size, 6 to 8 cords. Deficit, 3.7 to 5.7 cords. But fuel consumption, approximately 1/8 cord per week. Conventional consumption for a comparable cabin, 1/4 cord per week. Her cabin was burning half the wood that a new-built cabin would require. At this rate, her wood supply would last until early February. Not comfortable, not safe, but possible. The black walls were holding heat. The charcoal clay chinking was not cracking. The south-facing wall, struck by the low winter sun for a few precious hours each day, radiated warmth that she could feel with her palm. It was working. December 25th. Christmas. The boys woke to small gifts. Wooden toys Marta had carved during stolen hours. Rough figures that might have been horses or might have been dogs, depending on how you squinted. They played with them on the floor while Marta watched, her back against the south wall, feeling its warmth through her dress. The cabin was 38 degrees inside when they woke, cold, but not deadly. The stove needed feeding only every 3 hours. Thorson's words echoed in her memory. "You won't last until Christmas." Christmas had come. She was still here. Her boys were still here. But January was coming, and January, everyone said, was when the real cold arrived. The new year began quietly. January 1st, 1872. The temperature at dawn read 8 degrees above zero. Cold, but manageable. The sky was clear, the sun bright, and the south wall of the cabin warmed steadily through the morning. January 2nd, January 3rd, January 4th. Each day colder than the last, the temperatures declining in a steady march. 8 degrees, then 2, then 5 below zero. Marta watched the thermometer, watched the woodpile, watched the boys. The numbers had changed. The extreme cold meant faster fuel consumption, now 1/6 cord per week instead of 1/8. Her supply would last until early February at this rate, maybe late January if the temperatures kept dropping. The margin was razor thin. One bad week could erase it entirely. January 5th. The sky changed. High clouds streamed in from the northwest, thin and fast-moving, the kind that old settlers called mare's tails. Marta had learned to read them during her months in Peshtigo. They meant weather coming. They meant change. January the 6th, January 7th, January 8th. The clouds thickened. The temperature held steady at 12 below, brutal but stable. Marta fed the stove, watched the boys, and waited. January 9th, 1872. The morning dawned clear and cold, 14 degrees below zero. The sun rose into a sky that looked like polished steel, hard, bright, and empty. By noon, that sky had vanished. The clouds came from the northwest, moving faster than Marta had ever seen clouds move. They swallowed the sun in minutes. The temperature, which had been climbing slightly toward zero, stopped climbing. Then it began to fall. At 1 o'clock, the thermometer read 18 below. At 3 o'clock, it read 22 below. At 5 o'clock, when the last light faded from the sky, it read 31 degrees below zero. The wind arrived with the darkness. It came screaming down from Canada at 40 miles per hour, carrying snow that flew horizontal, cutting through gaps in clothing like it was searching for skin. The wind chill, a concept that wouldn't be named for another century, dropped the effective temperature to 60 below. Marta pulled the boys away from the window, where they had been watching the world disappear into white. She fed the stove until it glowed. She checked the chinking, running her hands along every seam, searching for drafts. The cabin creaked and groaned around them. The wind shrieked. The temperature inside, which had been 34 degrees when the storm began, dropped to 31, then 29. At 8 o'clock, Lars began to cough. By midnight, he was burning with fever, and the temperature was still falling. The fever came on fast. 1 hour Lars was coughing. The next he was limp in Marta's arms, his skin hot to the touch, his breathing shallow and ragged. She knew the signs. Every mother on the frontier knew them: croup, pneumonia, the diseases that killed one child in 4 before they reached age 5. In summer, you might survive them. In winter, with the temperature dropping and the wind screaming and no doctor within 20 miles, they were death sentences. Marta laid Lars on the pallet near the stove, piled every blanket they owned on top of him, and began boiling water. Steam. That was what her mother had done, what her grandmother had done. Steam to open the lungs, to ease the breathing, to give the body a chance to fight. But steam meant boiling water. Boiling water meant fuel. And fuel was the one thing she could not afford to waste. The stove consumed wood faster in extreme cold. She had measured it, tracked it, calculated it down to the stick. At 30 below zero with 40-mile winds, her cabin burned wood at nearly double the normal rate. The pile beside the door, her entire margin of survival, was shrinking by the hour. She fed the stove anyway. She had no choice. Eric sat in the corner watching. 6 years old, too young to understand the mathematics of their situation, old enough to understand that something was very wrong. His eyes moved from his brother's flushed face to the woodpile to his mother's hands as she added another log to the fire. "Is Lars going to die?" he asked. Marta did not answer. She hung a wet cloth near the stove, watched it begin to steam, adjusted Lars's position so the moist air would reach his face. Outside, the wind screamed. January 10th, 3 o'clock in the morning. The temperature outside had fallen to 33 degrees below zero. The wind had not slackened. The cabin walls creaked with every gust, and somewhere in the darkness, a tree, or what remained of one, cracked and fell with a sound like a gunshot. Inside, the thermometer read 31 degrees. Cold enough to see your breath. Cold enough that the water in the bucket beside the stove had a skin of ice on its surface. Lars's breathing had worsened. Each inhale was a wet rattle. Each exhale, a moan. Marta had been awake for 22 hours. Her hands shook as she added another log to the stove, as she boiled more water, as she held the steaming cloth near her son's face and prayed to a God she was no longer certain existed. The woodpile. She had counted it at midnight. 5 days' worth at normal consumption. Maybe 3 at this rate. 3 days. If the cold held for 3 days, she would run out of fuel. Then the temperature inside would drop. Then Lars would die. Then Eric would die. Then she would die. Thorson had been right. She was going to freeze in this burnt cabin, and no one would find them until spring. She added another log to the fire. Dawn came slowly, a gray lightning that barely deserved the name. The sun was up there somewhere, behind the clouds that had swallowed the sky. The wind still howled. The temperature still read 33 below. But something else was happening. Marta noticed it first as an absence, the absence of the bitter cold that had been seeping through the south wall all night. She pressed her palm against the logs, as she had done 100 times over the past months, expecting the chill that meant heat was bleeding out into the killing air. The wall was warm, not hot, not comfortable, but noticeably warmer than the north wall, warmer than the air inside the cabin, warmer than it had any right to be with the temperature outside at 33 below zero. The clouds had thinned, just slightly, just enough. The sun, low on the horizon, was finding its way through, and the black surface of the south wall was drinking every ray it could catch. Marta stood there for a long moment, her hand against the charred wood, feeling the warmth seep into her frozen fingers. The wall that everyone said was a ruin. The black surface that everyone said was weakness. It was absorbing sunlight that a pale wooden wall would have reflected. It was storing heat that a new cabin would have lost. She looked at the stove, at the fire burning inside it, at the wood she had been feeding into it all night. Then she made a decision. She let the fire burn down, not out. She kept enough coals to restart it quickly, but down, lower than she had ever let it go. The temperature inside the cabin dropped, 31 degrees, 30, 29. But the south wall kept warming. The thin winter sunlight filtered through clouds, struck the black surface for 3 hours that morning. By noon, the interior of the cabin had climbed back to 34 degrees, with barely any fuel consumed. Lars's fever had not broken. His breathing was still ragged, but he was no warmer and no colder than he had been at midnight. The cabin was holding. Half a mile to the north, the Paulson family was not so fortunate. They had built their cabin in November, fresh-cut pine, proper construction, conventional chinking of clay and straw. They had 5 cords of wood stacked outside, more than enough for a normal winter. They had a husband and father who knew how to swing an axe and keep a fire burning. None of it mattered. The fresh pine walls conducted heat outward like a sieve leaking water. The pale wood reflected what little sunlight reached it, gaining nothing from the winter sun. The conventional chinking, well applied as it was, had cracked in a dozen places when the temperature plunged, letting in knife blades of frozen air. By midnight on January 9th, the inside of the Paulson cabin had dropped to 24 degrees despite the stove burning at full capacity. By dawn on January 10th, Carl Paulson had gone outside to bring in more wood just 20 feet from his door to the woodpile and returned with frostbite on both hands. The skin had turned white and waxy in less than 5 minutes. By noon, the family had made a decision. They could not stay. They bundled their 3 children in every piece of clothing they owned, wrapped them in blankets, and set out for the Hendrickson place, a mile to the east, where smoke still rose from the chimney and they might find shelter. They made it. Barely. The youngest child, a girl of 2, would lose 3 toes to the cold. The Paulson cabin stood empty, its fire dead, its walls already cooling toward the temperature of the grave. Old Henrik Thorsen, 3/4 of a mile to the west, was fighting his own battle. His cabin was well built. He had constructed it himself 12 years ago, and he knew every joint and beam. He had 8 cords of wood, enough for 2 winters if he was careful. He had experience, decades of it, surviving cold that killed weaker men. But he was 63 years old. His joints ached in the cold. His hands, once strong enough to swing an axe from dawn to dusk, now cramped and stiffened after an hour's work. And the fire needed constant feeding, every 90 minutes in this cold, more often when the wind gusted, which meant he could not sleep for more than an hour at a time. By the morning of January 10th, he had been awake for 30 hours. His fire had burned low twice while he dozed, and twice the temperature inside had plunged toward freezing before he woke and fed it back to life. By the morning of January 11th, he found ice in the water bucket beside his bed. The fire had died to embers while he slept, and the cabin had dropped to 19 degrees. He rebuilt it with shaking hands, cursing his weakness, knowing that he was losing a battle he had won a dozen times before. His toes, in the boots he had not removed in 2 days, had gone numb. He did not notice until later. By then, it was too late. Closer to town, the Meyer family faced a different crisis. Their daughter, age 7, had developed a fever the day before the cold snap hit. By January 10th, she needed medicine, something, anything, to bring the fever down before it burned through her small body. Franz Meyer made a decision. The general store was 200 yards away, across an open field. 200 yards. He had walked it 1,000 times. He would walk it again, get the medicine, and return before the cold could touch him. He told his wife he would be back in 10 minutes. She never saw him alive again. The wind caught him halfway across the field. The snow, blowing horizontal, erased the world in seconds. He could not see the store. He could not see his own cabin. He could not see anything but white. He walked in circles for 20 minutes, his body temperature dropping, his extremities going numb, his mind clouding as the cold crept into his core. When they found him 3 days later, he was 20 feet from his own door. He had walked past it in the whiteout and never known. His daughter survived. The fever broke on its own. She would grow up without a father, killed by 200 yards of winter air. January 11th, the worst night. The temperature outside fell to 35 degrees below zero. The wind peaked at 50 miles per hour. The wind chill dropped to something that no longer had meaning, cold beyond cold, a temperature at which exposed flesh froze in minutes, and the air itself became a weapon. Inside Marta's cabin, the thermometer read 28 degrees. Cold. Desperately cold, but not killing cold. Not yet. Lars had been sick for 2 days. His fever had risen and fallen, each cycle a little weaker than the last. His cough had deepened into something that sounded like tearing cloth. Marta had not slept more than 20 minutes at a stretch since the storm began. She had burned through her fuel faster than planned, the sick child, the constant boiling water, the steam treatments that might or might not help. The woodpile that had held 5 days' worth at midnight on January 9th now held perhaps 2 days' worth, maybe less. But the sun had helped, even filtered through clouds, even striking the cabin for only a few hours each day. The solar heat absorbed by the black walls had made a difference. On January 10th, she had let the fire burn low for 4 hours during the day without the temperature dropping below 30 degrees. She had saved perhaps a quarter day's worth of fuel. Not much, but something. Now it was night again. The sun was gone. The wind was screaming, and Lars was worse. Marta sat beside the stove, feeding it logs she could not spare, watching her son breathe in wet, rattling gasps. Eric had fallen asleep in the corner, wrapped in a blanket, his face pale in the firelight. The cabin groaned around them, the charred walls flexing against the wind. She thought about Gunnar, about the night they met at a dance in Trondheim, when he had asked her to waltz and she had said yes before her mother could object. About their wedding, small and simple, in the church where her grandmother had been baptized. About the crossing, 6 weeks in the belly of a ship that smelled of vomit and despair, and the way he had held her hand through the worst of the storms. About the fire. About watching him walk toward the factory that morning, not knowing it was the last time. About finding what remained of him in the ash. She had survived the fire. She had survived the river. She had survived the weeks of hunger and cold and doubt that followed. She would not let his sons die in this cabin. She added another log to the fire, and another, and another. January 12th, 3 o'clock in the morning. Lars's breathing changed. Marta had been dozing. She could not help it, her body shutting down despite her will, and the change woke her instantly. The wet rattle was gone. The labored gasps were gone. In their place was something quieter, something steadier. She pressed her hand to his forehead. The fever had broken. Not completely. He was still warm, still sick, still weak, but the killing heat that had burned through him for 2 days had finally begun to recede. His body was fighting. His body was winning. She sat back, her hand over her mouth, and wept. Outside, the wind had died. The temperature was still brutal, 29 below zero, but the screaming gusts that had battered the cabin for 3 days had finally exhausted themselves. The world was silent except for the creak of frozen wood and the soft crackle of the fire. Dawn came slowly. Gray light seeped through the window, revealing a world buried in white. The snow had drifted against the north wall, piling 3 feet deep in places. But the south wall was clear. The wind had scoured it bare, and when the sun finally broke through the clouds around 10 o'clock, Marta watched the black surface begin to warm. She let the fire burn down to embers. The temperature inside dropped to 26 degrees, the coldest it had been since the storm began, but she did not add fuel. She waited. By noon, the south wall was radiating heat she could feel from across the room. The temperature inside had climbed to 33 degrees without a single log added to the stove. The black wood, drinking the winter sun, was doing what Henrik Thorsen and Ingrid Nielsen and everyone else had said was impossible. It was keeping them alive. January 13th. The cold snap began to break. The temperature climbed to 18 below zero, still brutal but survivable. The sky cleared. The sun, unfiltered for the first time in 4 days, struck the south wall of Marta's cabin with full force. Inside, the temperature reached 41 degrees by mid-afternoon. Marta stood in the center of the room, feeling warmth on her face, and laughed. It was a strange sound. She had not laughed in months, and it brought Eric running from the corner where he had been playing with his wooden horse. "Mama, we're going to be all right," she said. "We're going to be all right." Lars was sitting up. His fever was nearly gone, his appetite returning. He had eaten broth that morning, thin stuff, barely more than hot water with salt, and kept it down. His cough remained, but it was looser now, productive, the sound of a body clearing itself rather than drowning. The woodpile beside the door held perhaps 2 days' worth of fuel. It was not enough. It was not close to enough. But the worst of the cold had passed, and outside, in the burnt forest, there was still standing dead timber that could be cut and split and burned. Marta pulled on her coat, wrapped her hands in the cloth strips that served as gloves, and stepped outside for the first time in 4 days. The world was white and silent. The snow squeaked under her boots, a sound that meant extreme cold, colder than anything she had known in Norway. Her breath hung in clouds, her eyelashes frosted over within minutes. But she was outside. She was standing. She was alive. She walked to the woodpile, assessed what remained, then looked toward the tree line where the charred skeletons of fire-killed timber stood waiting. 2 hours of work, maybe 3. She could add another day's worth of fuel to the pile before dark. She picked up the axe. January 18th, Henrik Thorsen came to call. Marta saw him coming from a distance, a figure moving slowly through the snow, limping badly, using a walking stick she did not remember him having. He stopped at the edge of her property and stood there for a long moment looking at the cabin. She went out to meet him. Up close, he looked older than she remembered. Gaunt. The cold snap had cost him. She could see it in the hollows of his cheeks, the tremor in his hands, the way he favored his right foot. "Thorsen," she said. "Mrs. Svensson." He did not move toward the cabin. He just stood there, looking at the black walls, the intact roof, the smoke rising from the chimney. 35 below, 5 days. You kept 2 children alive in a burnt shack. I did. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind stirred the snow around their feet. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called. I was wrong, he said. The words hung in the air between them. Marta had imagined this moment, or something like it, during the long nights of the cold snap. She had imagined triumph, vindication, the satisfaction of proving the doubters wrong. What she felt instead was tired and cold and still afraid, because winter was not over, and her woodpile was still thin, and her son was still recovering, and 100 things could still go wrong. "Come inside," she said. "I have coffee, thin but hot." Thorsen hesitated. Then he nodded and followed her into the cabin. Inside, he stood near the stove, warming his hands, his eyes moving over everything, the charred walls, the thick black chinking, the south wall where the afternoon sun was already creating a pocket of warmth. Eric and Lars watched from the corner, wary of this stranger in their home. "How?" Thorsen asked finally. Marta showed him the charcoal clay mixture, the layers built up over weeks, the way the black surface absorbed sunlight that pale wood would have reflected, the thermal mass of the charred logs, storing heat during the day, releasing it slowly through the night, stayed warm. The chinking that did not stay warm, the chinking that did not crack, the cabin that consumed half the fuel of his own. Thorsen listened, asked questions, ran his hand over the chinking, pressed his palm against the south wall, examined the seams where black met black. "I've built 7 cabins, he said when she was finished. "Never thought of burnt wood as anything but ruin. Never thought a woman alone could." He stopped himself. "I've been wrong about a lot of things." He finished his coffee, set the cup down carefully, and rose to leave. "I'll tell the others," he said at the door. "They should know." Marta watched him limp away through the snow. He moved slower than he had in October, when he had walked this same path to tell her she was going to die. He had lost 2 toes to the cold. She learned that later, 2 toes, frozen black and dead, cut off by a doctor in Green Bay 3 days after the cold snap broke. The man who had told her she would not last until Christmas had survived the winter, but it had cost him. It had cost everyone. Everyone except the woman in the burnt cabin, who had kept her children alive with charcoal and clay and a folk memory of fence posts that lasted longer than they should. The weeks that followed brought visitors. Ingrid Nilsson came first, 4 days after Thorson's visit. She had rechinked half her cabin's north wall with the charcoal clay mixture, following Marta's instructions, and wanted to report that it was working, fewer drafts, less fuel consumed, the wall noticeably warmer on sunny days. "I said February would judge," she said. "It did. You were right." She brought flour, 2 pounds, more than Marta could afford, and would not accept payment. "You taught me something worth more than flour," she said. "Consider it settled." The Anderson family came next. Their north wall had been a constant problem, ice forming on the inside surface, cold seeping through no matter how much they stoked the fire. Could Marta show them the technique? She could. She did. She walked them through it step by step, gathering charcoal, mixing it with clay, applying it in layers, letting each layer dry before adding the next. The Andersons worked for 2 days, and when they were finished, their north wall held heat like it never had before. The Petersons came. The Hendricksons came. Even Carl Paulson, whose family had fled their cabin in the depths of the cold snap, came to ask what Marta had done differently. She told them all. She showed them all. She asked nothing in return, except that they share the knowledge with others who might need it. By the end of February, at least 8 families in the Peshtigo area had adopted some version of her technique. The charcoal clay chinking spread from cabin to cabin, a piece of practical wisdom passed hand to hand. People stopped calling it strange. They started calling it the black chinking, or the widow's method, or simply what Marta does. The hostile skeptic, Aldous Breck, never returned. The railroad's interest in Marta's property quietly evaporated. A widow who could survive a killing winter was not the easy acquisition he had hoped for. His offer was never renewed. Years later, the rail spur he had been planning was built 2 miles to the east, through land that had nothing to do with a burnt cabin on the forest's edge. Within 2 years of the cold snap, at least 12 families in the Peshtigo area had adopted some version of Marta's techniques. The charcoal clay chinking became common enough that settlers stopped calling it unusual. Several fire-damaged structures that owners had planned to demolish were instead repaired and occupied, their charred exteriors left intact, their gaps sealed with the black mixture Marta had improvised from necessity. She never charged for the knowledge, never sought recognition. When people came to learn, she showed them. When they left, she went back to her work, raising 2 boys, tending a small garden in the burnt-over clearing, surviving one winter after another in the cabin that everyone said would kill her. The charred house at 150 South Beebe Avenue still stands today, more than 150 years after the fire. Its blackened timber is still visible, still intact, still occupied. Marta's cabin was not that house. Hers was smaller, rougher, less permanent. But it proved the same principle. Burnt wood is not ruin. It is a material that endures. Wasset. Marta Svensson lived in the charred cabin for 19 more years. She never remarried. The boys grew. Eric became a carpenter in Green Bay, Lars a logger in the northern woods. Both credited their survival to a mother who saw value in what others discarded. In 1884, Marta finally replaced the chinking, not because it had failed, but because she wanted to test a new mixture. The charcoal clay had held for 13 years without crumbling. She died in 1891, age 49, of pneumonia, the same illness that had nearly taken Lars during the cold snap of '72. The cabin stood empty for 6 years before a farmer bought the land and tore it down. He noted the blackened walls, the thick, dark chinking still intact after 2 decades. He did not know what it meant. He burned the lumber for fuel. January 9th, 1872. The temperature dropped 43 degrees in 9 hours. 35 below zero with wind that cut through solid wood. Henrik Thorsen, who had survived 19 Wisconsin winters, had told her plainly, "Those boys will freeze in their beds, and no one will find your bodies until spring." The boys did not freeze. On the worst night of the worst cold snap in 20 years, Marta Svensson's charred cabin held 31 degrees warmer than the air outside. Her sick child recovered. Her woodpile, smaller than any experienced settler thought survivable, lasted through to spring. The burnt walls that everyone called a ruin turned out to hold heat better than fresh-cut pine. She had no science, no engineering, no training. She had 14 cents and a folk memory that burnt wood lasts longer. She had 2 children she refused to let die. The cabin is gone now. The charred wood that saved 3 lives is ash. But for 19 winters, the blackened walls held.